Welcome. So this talk I entitled Conscious Coupling for Anti-Fragility and Anti-Fragile Teams. My name is Dave Laribee. I've done a bunch of stuff in the past. Right now, kind of my focus is as a full stack playing coach. We won't say Agile, we're trying to get away from that term. But my background's kind of really in XP, hands-on, little architecture, little design, little engineering management, a little bit of everything. I've done kind of been there, done that in at least at the team scale. I draw the line at, trying to scale agility, that kind of thing. So this is a somewhat technical talk, and it's couched in kind of Node.js. I could really consider this like a duplex talk, like a duplex book, where the first part we're just going to kind of define coupling in a couple of terms. And the second part, I'll show you a little bit how I kind of put together loops in a non-traditional Agile way to guide teams through managing some of these issues with coupling. Okay, and I'll have links and slides at the end. Okay, so a couple motivations that led me to this talk. My most recent gig, I was at a huge Fortune 50 retailer that was doing a big DevOps transformation, big enterprise DevOps transformation. It's going okay. My mission was to kind of come in as head coach of this massive, what they call DevOps dojo. So teams would come in, we'd up to 12 teams at a time. This is a pretty light day. This is a Friday. I didn't really want to disturb people in my weird like selfie stick going down the hallway. But at any given time, you'd have 12 teams kind of running through a 30-day challenge trying to do the DevOps, right? And so you talk about DevOps, in a way, I think you're really kind of talking about ops dev when you have a bunch of operational people that are learning how to write Ruby, learning how to write Java, JavaScript, whatever, learning how to write code that isn't just one big, massive transaction script. So I kind of ran into this problem where, we'd have a bunch of teams coming to this dojo and saying, oh, we're doing Cassandra as a service. And eventually it kind of becomes Cassandra as a service, and Cassandra as a service as a service. So you kind of, this enterprise space, lots of tooling being developed, but not a particular kind of focus of what's happening. Also, operational people, bless their heart, aren't the best coders. So I've kind of found myself in a position of not having to run in, guns blazing, saying test-driven development, object-oriented, all that stuff. I kind of had to come in and say, well, let's start from ground zero and talk about things like modular coupling. Let's talk about things like structured programming, computer science 101, maybe something they haven't really encountered in their past. So that's one of the kind of motivations. The other motivations, because this is couched in Node.js, and then my most recent production coding experience has been in, Node.js microservices. And it's an interesting space, I'll say. But of course, earlier this year we had the whole NPM gate issue go down. Too long didn't read. This guy, Azer, or I forgot his name, Azer Kokulo, published this thing, left pad, which will kind of left pad a string with a character of your choice. Turns out, basically, well, he got pissed because this company, Kik, used their lawyers to say, no, you can't use this name, whatever his namespace was. And, he's like, fuck off, and he pulled all his shit from NPM. All of it, some like 200 modules. So, super prolific open source developer. All of his modules were really kind of, in general, pretty tiny. In turn, this kind of screwed up the universe of web development. Ultimate, outcome wasn't good for everyone. Everyone kind of showed up to work and had a bad day, right? So, just as a kind of, just put a nail in this meme is kind of over, but it's interesting example of a fragility problem, right? So I'll give you a little PSA. I kind of got to read this because I don't remember. But if you publish a module to NPM, you have 24 hours to change your mind. Maybe you publish something embarrassing. Maybe, you just discovered it didn't work, right? You woke up in a kind of fever dream sweat. Over 24 hours, pretty much that's where we're in the PSA here. You've got to contact support at npm.js. This is at the time of the first iteration of this talk. I've done it about 4 times, so it may have changed. But I'm sure at least over 24 hours it goes in a more human direction, and that's probably a good thing, right? Especially if you have this kind of web of dependencies. Now, just a side note, there's this new thing called Yarn from Facebook. You might want to check it out. It is a alternative client to NPM that takes a little bit different tack on dependencies. We're not going to go super far into it, but I just want to kind of point that out and make you aware that Yarn is a little bit more of an intentional dependency, package manager. So, we can't really blame Azure because, the man came after him. All these attorneys came after him, right? We're not on the side of attorneys, we're on the side of developers. We can't really blame NPM. I mean, it's a kind of young bureaucracy. It's a new organization. Node.js is full of people that are full of, kind of piss and vinegar and enthusiasm, and they want to get it done. So they have to develop their bureaucracy as time goes on and figure these kinks out as they come. So there's really no one you can blame, maybe other than yourself. So we'll look at some techniques for how we can get around that. So in my mind, keep in mind, I am not the most hardcore distributed system algorithmic Google Facebooker in the world. I'm pretty much like a designer, object-oriented guy, a little bit of functional. So in my mind, if we can nail these 4 things, we're doing pretty good in terms of maintainability, in terms of system that makes sense, in terms of being able to keep a rhythm of deployment and delivery, right? We're going to focus mainly on coupling today, and just certain aspects of coupling. So there are many forms of coupling. Temporal, for example, we're going to focus on social coupling and modular coupling and the relationship between the two. Some people would say there are more important things to focus on. There are plenty of other talks that will deal with these things, so I'm just kind of giving you a respite from the hardcore nerds. So let's focus on coupling. So in my mind, the 2 kind of things that interplay, it's not just that we have modules or packages or assemblies or whatever kind of coupling together. It's that there are social dynamics that lead to unhealthy conditions when it comes to coupling. Anyone know what movie that's from? 2001, right? It's a really interesting coupling problem in there. So I first want to focus on modular coupling and just do some kind of basic definitions. So a component, let's talk about a component. A component, a package, an NPM module, all the same thing in my world, right? Arguably, a function could be considered a component. Pure function, certainly. Provides some kind of value, is explicit about its needs, and it's a unit over use. More importantly, perhaps it's a unit over replacement. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll be returning to that over and over again throughout the talk. Any electrical engineers in the room? They've taken the step down to software development. Very nice. So I like to think about fan in, fan out logic circuits. So basic component here we have an AND gate. It takes 2 inputs that are capable of having a true and false value, and 1 output, that can be connected to any number of inputs limited by load. That's physics and electronics, right? So here we have a kind of very, very fundamental component. Arguably not would be more fundamental, but really kind of simple thing. So Uncle Bob's terms, efferent and afferent coupling. Now there's actually a math to coupling. It's a really simple math. It's nothing to get too excited about. It's nothing to be intimidated by. Efferent coupling is a measure of dependency on other components. So your component depends on other components, right? So there's some components where this type of coupling is a fact of life, right? Things that are like facade, service, controller, that kind of thing. You're just going to have a lot of dependencies in there because they're doing orchestration. Right? So they're high efferent coupling. Fan out, in terms of the logic circuit, these are outbound dependencies. Afferent coupling is measurement of how components are dependent on other components. So I like to think of this as like how popular a component is, how used it is by others. Okay, so that's afferent coupling. Instability, simple, there's the math, pretty intimidating, huh? So instability is simply efferent coupling over the sum of efferent and afferent coupling. So we can look at this as an example. So imagine a component X. Inside component X, there are calls to component A, B, C, D, E, and F. And so X has a efferent coupling of 6. So 6 divided by 6 plus 1 equals 0.86. So what we can say is this component X is a fairly unstable component. Again, something like a controller, something that's doing orchestration, something that is kind of gluing together a bunch of stuff, right? Now, I'm going to put it back to you. What do you think if a component has an instability of 0, which would be a perfectly stable component? What is that component? It's a potato, right? Potatoes are actually more useful. No, it's a staple of Lithuanian cuisine. And American cuisine, French fries. Anyway, most cuisines. So there's a little briefing on modular coupling. So the instability factor. So when you have something in your package JSON in your Node app, and it's, you have a million dependencies in there, you probably have a fairly unstable application in terms of when you go to update those dependencies. All right, so that's something we need to kind of pay attention to, and we'll look in the second half at some tools for doing just that. So now let's talk about social. I am a programmer. I write code pretty much every day, and but I'm also kind of a coach that comes in and helps teams with some of their issues. So I consider that programming with people, not programming people. It's a very different thing, but programming with people, and then kind of sitting with them, pairing and working through. But social is certainly a really big part of the coupling equation. It wouldn't be a software development talk if we didn't reference Melvin Conway and Conway's famous law. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. Very hierarchical organization, very hierarchical and bureaucratic software, right? Pretty simple. So, given that, we could talk a little bit about monoliths, mudballs, and Noir. So here's not quite a mudball. This is interestingly called the Enterprise Dependency Big Ball of Yarn. Right, and this is kind of the classic issue. I just ganked this from Daily WTF. But here what you're seeing along the edge, these are types in our system, and we have inbound and outbound efferent and afferent coupling here. Has anyone ever worked on a system like this? It's just a nightmare. You pull one thing and it's like your stack just evaporates, right? You cannot reason about this system. Very, very difficult thing. And the irony is a lot of systems that are successful in a startup way end up that way because speed trumps quality. So I think there's a new thing operating, which we could call the big bucket of glue, right? Certainly Node has experienced this, Ruby community to an extent has experienced this, where there's a ton of innovation going on, right? There's a ton of resume building really going on. And what really happens is you end up with something a little bit like this. You end up with a glue factory, right? So you have our little brony programmers entering the factory and exiting through a tube, right? So this big bucket of glue is a notion that now our application, instead of it being coupled to types that we own maybe, is coupled to the universe to the point where we have something like LeftPad. We outsource the development of that. We no longer write that software, which to me seems totally effing crazy, right? That you would do something like that. You may disagree. I hope you do. And we can have a nice discussion about it. So, NPM gate, comes along and one of your dependencies break and you end up with this kind of issue. So all kinds of painful effects, a ton of painful effects. Namely, what's going to happen here? Oh no. Boink! Right? So, one little thing like LeftPad can take down something like, I don't know, React, which can then take down something like, I don't know, most web apps, right? You're kind of jacked up. This is actually a Pepsi commercial. I come from Atlanta, so don't tell anyone because it's the home of Coca-Cola and they would kick me out. Also, it kind of does relate a little bit. Try not to stare too hard at this slide. I apologize. Yeah, it's kind of, we'll just skip ahead. It relates to complexity a bit too, this coupling thing. So if you have so many things going on, if you have so many dependencies in your application, it can be very hard to reason about the structure of your application, it could be very difficult to do something like update a individual dependency. It creates this kind of cognitive load for the team that maybe isn't the best thing ever. So, this happens, right? How are we going to get around having classes like controllers or services or orchestrators or facades or whatever? We're not. We're going to have things that orchestrate things, right? How are we going to get around using something like a standard library or one of the classic criticisms of JavaScript is there is no standard library, right? I'd argue maybe there is, but we have to couple. We are going to use additional types. We are going to use things that we're not going to develop, that aren't in our core competencies. So next part, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can kind of put together some beats and loops to get into a rhythm with our team to figure out how, to have reasonable dependencies. So, intentionally left blank. So our beats, sensing, learning, acting. We'll come back to this as kind of a fundamental workflow. I think a lot of what I do is take some of these beats. These are just examples, high-level beats. We'll look at specific instances of these beats, as I call them, but they're moves, they're actions, they're things that we can develop, they're skills, right? And we can combine them in interesting ways. So let's look at some of these. Let's start with the sensing beats. So smell, classically, everyone probably knows about this, but you have a number of code smells, right, that you can kind of identify in your code when you're looking at coupling. So this could be modular coupling, it could be interior coupling in your own classes, functions, whatever. I like to call these guys out. This is a group, I think based in Belgium, Quality Without a Name. They have this interesting set of cards, which is a great thing to break out for your teams during exercise time or retrospective time or code review time. And they kind of break through a number of the code smells. So here we have feature envy. This is where you might have an anemic model, not so much a problem in the functional domain because everything's kind of set up to be that way. But like when you're using an object-oriented paradigm, certainly a problem. You have a class that's more interested in the data of another. It maybe should encapsulate that data in itself. Message chains and train wrecks. Certainly this doesn't apply when you have something kind of like fluent type interface where you're building and just keep returning this, returning this, returning this, returning self. But these are the kind of senses, right, that when you start to look at code and you become more senior, it becomes more instinctual. You catch a whiff that there's something wrong, right? There are human smells too, but we won't talk about those just now. Listening. So these are kind of abstract senses, I would say. Listening, we have something entering the ear, and we know it's not quite right, right? And by ear, I mean, the abstract ear, right? The third ear, right? For example, Angular 1.0 always kind of pissed me off, right? In that you had to run through this ridiculous set of gyrations. If we look at this, the picture's a little washed out. The important thing to know here is we haven't actually gotten to a test at this point. This is all boilerplate. This is all kind of framework tax, which to me is, if I were writing this test, listening to my test, this is something that I would say early on pretty much, I'm not going to go down this Angular path, right? So listening. Another thing, I just call this Zeitgeist, but this is kind of the sense of what's happening in the culture around you. So what we're seeing here is a team that I worked with for quite a long time, actually. So this is way back. There's me and a bunch of people. And so this is version 1. We made this kind of ideas application, which is kind of like a user voice type application. Version 1 is the Agile planning tool. So a user could submit an idea and you'd see that idea go all the way through the life cycle of the application, become a story, enter an iteration, get worked on, deployed, etc. And this is a really good example of a failure. Now what's happening that's nice is total collective ownership, total XP team, total test-driven development, functioning in an engineering sense, almost to perfection, right? But what you see up here is you can just look at the namespace of the .NET project, version1.innovations.test. The lonely tester, right, is up there kind of working and accumulating these automated test suites. And if you come to my talk tomorrow, basically approaching this anti-pattern of the inverted testing triangle, really just more of a box. We had some like 7,000 unit tests here, isolated unit tests, but then we ended up with like, she wrote 2,000 automated tests that just totally coupled end-to-end UI tests, right? Totally coupled the testing to the thing. Had I gotten out as a coach, I might have been able to prevent that. So this is a social coupling issue. This social coupling led to a coupling of tests, which are code, to code, our production code. So this kind of goes around, right? This is something to pay attention to. I don't make this mistake anymore. Some mistakes I make more than once, but this is the one I can proudly say I've only made one. And Joel and I are still friends, so it's worked out in the end. So in terms of Zeitgeist, we'll look at a couple of other interesting German words. Gestalt, something I think is really important in terms of Zeitgeist. Is your team functioning in a way that you're producing something that, we're looking for like 3x teams, not 10x developers, right? That's often the case for me. Another good German word is Backpfeifengeschicht. I'm sorry, my German is not so great, but I think this applies to me in that case. Like, I probably could have used a slap in the face. Just a quick note, that tool is called Gorse. Gorse you can run against any Git repo, and it will show you this kind of swarming, and it's a bit eye candy, but it also gives you this gut, this kind of sense of zeitgeist of what's happening on the team. If you see people working on the nodes individually, you might have a silo problem or not, but that's happening. Right? If you see certain parts of the system just staying in existence, it will fade away, things that are churned less. You know that you've got a hot spot in your system, which is fine. It just gives you a vector. It's a sense. Okay, let's move on. And there's certainly other senses, right? These are some of this listening is a bit of a stretch, but some of these things, are kind of more metaphorical senses, and that's the way to think about it. You could also put down here some things in the DevOps world like automated canary. That's a sense that you've kind of automated, right? So let's move on to learn. So learning, again, not a comprehensive list, but the way I think about it is kind of an envisioning beat, an empathy beat, and an exposing beat, right? Sorry, my mic pack is all jacked up. So envisioning, here what we're saying is develop a sense of an ideal as a team. Like, where do you want to head? You may have what you have, but where can you head and where do you want to head? For me, a sensible default is something like evolutionary design, right? If we look at like Stephen Jay Gould, 1972, the morphology of a system, this tends to be the morphology gradual changes of a big ball of mud or a big bucket of glue. Right? Whereas proper evolutionary design where we have punctuated equilibria, we have moments of decimation, we are going to have moments where components, think of a component as a unit of reuse and replacement, can just be taken out, right? So that's kind of a sensible default. Can we get there? Now there are certain applications where you can't get there, or getting there is going to be more of a long con over years to get there, right? Or accept the fact that you have what you have, document it, and move on. But that's kind of my default, sensible default, right? Hexagonal architecture, certainly. Hexagonal architecture is really, become ports and adapters, and it's become something of a, I just wanted to put that out there so at the party, everyone knew exactly how I felt about the current political situation. Not good. But, and also wanted to kind of tempt the code of conduct by mentioning safe sex and asshole on the same slide. But it's really all about protection, right? So your hexagon is kind of your port and adapter. You are trading the cost of driving out your application in terms of abstractions to the edge for the benefit of anything behind those adapters, the implementation of those adapters, not jacking up your day. I'll left pad npm gate. So, classically here we'll have the kind of test-driven style where, London style, where we'll drive out from an unstable component using our kind of mocks or stubs. We'll find adapters, we'll discover, and here notice red-green, there's not much refactoring at this stage. You're just kind of driving things out. You may discover application services. You may discover any number of things, a domain model or aspects of a domain model. Here you're switching more to kind of Detroit style or red-green refactor, state-based verification. And then you'll move in. So this is kind of outside in TDD. So for me, this is envisioning ideal. And this is kind of my standard bag of tricks. I'm prepared to, these are my strong opinions weekly held. If I enter a team, I'm prepared to let go of them if it's not possible. But if I'm starting something greenfield in the kinds of domains I've been working in, I'll reach for this. And once, after that, all that's done, you kind of hook up your adapters, right? This is where the gluing comes into place. And typically that's the kind of black swan aha moment people have with test-driven development. It's like, shit just works. Of course, like I said, you have to get real. I like the term strong opinions weekly held. Your ideal, will be developed in situ with your team, right? But that ideal should have some notion of coping with coupling. All right, another beat, empathize. This is something that did not come naturally to me. I think about, when I was kind of involved in the alt.net scene, like in 2008, I was kind of an asshole. And, maybe that's just part of me, but I think, the alpha programmer, the youthful kind of alpha programmer is something that I had to consciously let go of. One thing that was kind of eye-opening for me when I joined VersionOne anyway and changed my perspective and made me a little bit more empathetic is their software was very crazy. Like it was this kind of C# engine that would take a bunch of XML and make it anything application. So it could be an Agile planning tool, but if you knew the XML dialect, you could just easily make it a zookeeping application or anything, right? So it's kind of ambitious, architecture from the top-down application. But kind of understanding why they did that, they had this period of massive growth, and they were asked to do the same feature over and over and over and over and over again. So the architect, very smart dude, said, I'm just going to make an engine that makes making this class of feature very, very easy to develop. And then market competition set in. You have other players, Jira, Atlassian, Rally, and they're kind of taking a little bit more of a user-centered or activity-based UI approach, which totally changes the game of the kinds of features. We're not developing features, we're shipping experiences. The design fluency of the product increases. And that's exactly where I entered the company. And that was exactly the reason I was hired, right? So it was a lot of chafing in terms of why this is a problem. So once it took me about, I want to say a month, but let's be realistic, 3 months to kind of buy that and understand it and get ethnographic about why that was happening. And then things went much better because now we're talking about, we're here, how do we get to envisioning ideal? How do we get to our envisioned ideal? Another thing we can, what's going on in this picture? Right, this one probably doesn't work. It's become furniture, but we're blind to it, right? And that's something that painful effects, kind of medicating the symptom and not treating the cause can be part of, something that empathy can yield. This is happening, right? And we can start to work from that basis. It could be that, your organization, a number of teams I've worked with recently, Rails or even like some of the Node.js stuff, they've kind of gone into the full culturation of it and are finding that their domains are chafing a little bit against the framework. We looked a little bit at Angular 1.0. Angular 2 has done some work, but I probably will never use Angular because the transition from 1 to 2 is profoundly awful, right? But 2 is a little bit better testing store, but Angular 1, you're smiling, you kind of maybe know. But, so these frameworks can impose really strong constraints. Omakase Rails versus, fast test, right? There's this kind of chafing where at a certain point your application that you live with for a while, which is where I tend to work, you outgrow it. Right? It's like a modern insecticide. Modern insecticides basically freeze the shell of the insects, so they just kind of suffocate in their own shell. It's really horrifying. Okay, the last beat in this, expose. So this is just mainly kind of getting in and doing the work, doing the detective work of investigation. I'm going to share with you a little tool. So I'm using, the Strider is a CI, I think it's a Node.js CI, and what we're seeing here is a massive, massive number of dependencies. It does some work, but it is by and large a big bucket of glue. We're finding, I don't know, does anyone use Strider CI? I don't know if it's up to date. When I did this, it looked like it was a little bit behind or maybe kind of starting to be abandoned, as a project, but I don't want to diss them unnecessarily. Someone will see this and issue a death threat. So there's this tool, npm check. npm, Node Package Manager, has a thing called outdated. npm check is like npm outdated on steroids, and it's not a tool that I've run into. I've kind of been socializing in various Node.js meetups and stuff, and people don't really know about it. So this is a kind of interesting, we're going back a little bit into tech, but npm check is a really, really interesting thing. A couple things, a skip unused, that will prevent npm check from crawling into your node modules and checking those node modules for their dependencies being out of date, which will really give you an anxiety attack if you leave that switch off. So we want to typically run with skip unused, and then what we'll see is this, it's a little foobarred because of the size of the screen, but we'll see checking. You see kind of their major updates for all of these things that are dependencies of the application. So your next kind of move would be go into npm check -u, and you can go into an interactive update or -- update. I guess I should be pretending to type this right now. Live coding. We've learned the hard way not to do. And so now you can kind of click through all of these things, and it gives you a little bit of it groups them by how jacked up you can expect that experience to be, right? So it kind of uses semver, semantic versioning, to kind of say, you're in for quite a ride here, or this will be an easy win. But this kind of notion of keeping up to date with your dependencies, npm check, if you're using who's using Node.js really are you using npm check or something? Yeah, David is another one, I think. But there's a few ones. I found npm check to be kind of a pretty nice little tool. And then so typically with your workflow, then you would update and then run a dependency. And this is certainly something you could automate. This could be something as you do as a kind of dependency agitation test nightly or something to give you a little bit of heads up of, if you were to try to do this, you might have a problem. Anyone ever done a major jQuery upgrade? Right? I did one that took a couple months. Right? So you learn these things the hard way sometimes. Okay. So a couple learning moves, right? The notion is that we're doing some investigation, we're doing some discovery, and that's a tax. I mean, that's an ongoing thing with your team. It's something that you need to keep doing. So now let's talk about action, right? Let's take some steps towards making the world a better place. And I like to think of these actions as more experimental versus more decisive. That is, destroying something is totally non-reversible. It can be. But choosing to rewrite an application, sometimes it's reversed by just canceling that project and going back to the application, but it's costly. Reversal is super costly. Whereas, creating something side by side or simply tweaking something, you can quickly reverse that or decide to go in a different way and move back through this loop. So create, kind of bringing in the Amish DIY aesthetic. And I understand completely why people don't want to create in JavaScript. I think, if we think about it, I've been using JavaScript since the late 90s, back when here was the JavaScript developer experience. You go to a website, you copy the JavaScript, you paste the JavaScript, and now you've got, sparkles following your cursor all around the page. So obviously it's changed. I think jQuery kind of made people say, oh, this is pretty nice. And then we realized jQuery coupling the DOM, oh, this kind of sucks, right? And Node.js came along, this is kind of nice. And NPM came along with Node.js, and now it's like, it's a candy store, right? But I think there is a lesson we can take from legendary software development thought leader, Missy Misdemeanor Elliott. We won't go into the lyrics, but I will show you a really inefficient version of LeftPad, but just really as a means of showing you a library that I'm kind of enthused about using is Ramda, which is alternative Lodash or underscore. Any Ramda users? Okay. Did you create Ramda? Okay. No, okay, all right. I would fan out. I'm just saying. I might be a fan still. I'm just saying for that reason. But so let me just kind of skip this a little slow. Well, we'll let it play out. So I'm going to write left pad here. I will say this implementation of left pad is, while line count is much shorter than Azar's original implementation of left pad, it's certainly not efficient in any way. We're allocating arrays. We're doing all kinds of things that, string manipulation that are probably kind of expensive. So please don't critique me. And if I ever come to your team, we can go through a period of probation where you determine whether or not I'm allowed to write code. That's fine. I'm just trying to show you. I'm using Ramda's composition. You could use pipe using composition. So we want to read it from the bottom up just because we like to be obtuse as functional programmers. And all you're doing, the Missy Elliott stuff will come in a minute, flip it and reverse it. But we're splitting the string into a array of characters, concatenating it, adding a bunch of our padding characters to the string, and this is kind of all curried. So that's the deal with Ramdas. It's all the functions are pre-curried, so you can put them in this pipeline of functions or pipe or a composition of functions. So we'll reverse it. I thought I flipped it. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, close to Missy Elliott. And then we're able to kind of create a left pad from our generic left padder function. So very short, 1 to 14, 13 lines of code. Not efficient. Could be made efficient, though, by someone smarter than me with more time, right? So the notion is, I think, using something like this as an action, it kind of builds on itself. If you get into a culture, and this could be part of your envisioning the ideal. I shared you very much the peak of mid-2000s ideal, right, where we're kind of using object orientation, London School testing, and all that. But certainly this could be part of the more modern function or the kind of trending functional ideal where you're building through composition. And if that were part of your ideal, you wouldn't necessarily run into a left pad type issue. It's not going to prevent all coupling issues, but it's going to prevent a class of coupling issues, right? You're still coupling to your own code, but if your developers are capable of writing and reasoning about this small thing, then you're probably in pretty good shape to deal with coupling problems down the line. Okay. So lulls, this is from today, left pad, 10,500 almost downloads today and last day. So people are not really learning. Now, NPM has obviously changed their publishing policy. I'm not trying to engage in a bunch of logical fallacies, but I'm just saying there's something operating here in the JavaScript developer mindset. It's almost like the kind of the most typed statement in programming today is go to Stack Overflow, right? So defend, that's another option. So we can actually, if we want to really have a super, say we're really paranoid. Oop, yeah, sorry. And paranoia sometimes is a valid thing. You do run into cases where you have governance, InfoSec requirements, etc., where you probably need to be paranoid. I've worked at companies that have had major breaches, and they've lost a lot of shareholder value for that, right? So you run into this. So there's that kind of approach of maybe standing up your own module registry. You can stand up your own NPM registry, but that is, you're doing that, you're decreasing coupling, or you manage coupling from the outside in your organization, but you're increasing coupling inside your organization. Typically, when you have these private registries, that means that Alice and Bob now get to maintain this registry, which kind of adds a throttle to, or a bottleneck to that pipeline. So now you have to have people maintaining registry, or part of their time is Matrix to take care of that, private NPM registry, and it's really expensive. So it's a trade-off. It's an expensive choice. So paranoia, even at a small scale, isn't totally justified. There's a lo-fi way to do it. You can, for example, make your own kind of private repository out of your own GitHub, or wherever you're hosting your Git repo, assuming you're using Git, and you can reference right from a repository branch and even SHA-1 commit, right, hash. So this it would expect a package JSON there, and it will reference that specific point in time in your Git history. So you can, go that way. And with that, you can do something like fork funky dependencies or fork dependencies where you like it, you need it, but you think you're going to have to be involved in the community that supports it. So you're going to kind of have a fork and pull request workflow between you and that supplier. Here's a tool, Nexi. It's kind of interesting. I like it I use this for a project I was on for pipeline dependencies, and we would kind of Nexi it and just package it all together. In the enterprise, they love to use heavy tools like Artifactory, but this kind of gives you the same thing. It packages it all up in one thing. You could also use the tarball. So another action we potentially have is rehabilitate. So, classically we could say refactoring, right, is a way of rehabbing code in small. I'll show you my favorite example of rehabilitation. Was working on a Node.js project that I think it was ProxyQuire or Requirify. I can't remember. I think it's ProxyQuire. But basically, ProxyQuire would let you, during test time, stub the require call. So you could supply modules that were being required in the module under test with your fake, test double or test double of some sort, right? So we kind of switched to doing this, we call, this works well when you're doing the class style, for what it's worth. I don't know why you do that, but in Node.js, and this works well, like, you can create this withdrawal funds if, we're using default parameters here, no problem, all day long, or you can feed it with test doubles if you need it to during test. So we've basically eliminated one huge dependency between our test code and our production code, which is this ProxyQuire, right, which lets you kind of cut it in there. So that's a refactoring, right, where you're just, inlining require. I just made my own refactoring. Look at me go. Another thing we have in terms of action and choice of action is to reorganize. So it's kind of tempting to npm install -d or -save with impunity and just not kind of really think about the cost of that. But I think, in a way, we should kind of be hiring our dependencies as carefully as we hire our people, or at least a tenth as carefully as we hire our people. So I'm not sure how you guys go about determining whether or not something is going to be introduced, or if you even think about it. But when you have an application that's making money and it's owned by a group of people, I think it's wise to kind of do a little bit of due diligence. I'll typically kind of look at, issues, of course, look at their issue namespace, look at the number of issues, look at the pulse, look at how many committers there are, look at the history of committers over time. Just like you develop a hiring process, I'll leave it to you, but what is the hiring process for your dependencies? Clearly, license sometimes matters. I mean, if you're kind of an open source model, MIT, fine, whatever, but if you have a commercial software or service, that license may mean something to you. Lawyers exist. We have to deal with that, right? So lastly, I'll say one action you always have is you have the nuclear option. It's just too soon. Jesus. Anyway, we'll get through it together, people. Okay. So we can always kind of nuke the software. We can always, potentially, think of ourselves as components as well, right? Components is unit of replacement. Hopefully it's you self-replacing, but you can certainly take yourself out of the equation if this coupling issue is a little bit too big. I think this is a kind of a final resort thing. You either in the software realm, this would be like the big rewrite. In the individual career realm, this would be like Johnny Cash, take this job and shove it. But, if coupling, social or modular, or combination of both becomes a little bit too big, you have this option, right? This is an action. You're choosing to exit the loop. And, you know, you can't swing a dead cat in this industry without hitting a recruiter. So it's pretty easy to find a job. So it is kind of a buyer's market, I think, in terms of development. I'm not telling everyone to leave their job, please, but you know, if it's that bad, you could. So back to loops and beats. Because Greg so thoughtfully put together this retro gaming concept, I think this kind of fits pretty well. But these loops and beats become really, really powerful as just a kind of mental model. If you're thinking, if you're a tech lead, if you're an engineering manager, if you're senior engineer, senior developer, kind of thinking, and you're partially responsible for mentoring the talent on your team, it can be valuable to kind of have this little mental model to think through how you can work with the team to become more practiced with this stuff. So if we look at our model, something like sensing a code spell and rehabilitating, refactoring, that becomes more automatic, and the mental model goes away. It goes into the realm of fluency and mastery, right? If we look at something more difficult, like dealing with legacy code, dealing with technical debt, we might need to employ multiple senses, listening to what the code is telling us, listening to what tests are telling us, taking the temperature of the room, understanding why things are happening, using all of our learning skills, all of our learning moves, like envisioning an ideal. What could we get to with this kind of big ball of mud? How could we understand why we arrived at this big ball of mud so we don't come off as accusatory asshole? And then what can we do to examine what is the cost of moving this big ball of mud into something like, you know, maybe we just kind of document it and defend it and hunker down, right? Or maybe we actually go and reorganize bits of it. So this loop is kind of complicated, going all around kind of thing, right? So in conclusion, I'll leave you my favorite Don Reinerson quote. Don Reinerson, very famously, the lean thing. He's one of those lean guys, though, that actually backs it up with mathematics. If you ever get a chance to go to one of his workshops or talks, it's fun to watch the Agile people in the rooms, just kind of their heads pop off one by one. You know, and it's like he's talking queuing theory, so it's really, really funny. But he's a legit dude. I like this notion of the only best practices are learning, experimentation, and situational awareness. So in reverse, sensing, kind of it jumbled up a little bit, but sensing, learning, and acting, right? And with that, I'm over. I think we've got a little bit of time if you have questions or want to share experiences or anxiety attacks. But other than that, thank you very much for your time and attention. Oh, wow. This is fancy. Do I measure memory usage for degradation? No, but I'm certainly happy that someone on the team will. Where's that question come from? Help me understand that a little. Is this to do with my Ramda left pad? It's not my area. I'm not a performance hacker by any stretch of the imagination, but I would defer to a specialist that would, you know. Okay. Do things like Nexi or Noir cope with native modules dependencies, C compiled? Have not encountered that, but I'm happy to, you know, look. I'm not really sure. What about tools like Sinopia, local proxy, as a compromise between full NPM clone versus hitting real NPM all the time? That's news to me. What about who mentioned that? You want to talk? Yeah.
It's a tool called Sinopia, which is it's not a full NPM clone with all the code base or whatever they have underneath.
Yeah.
You just set up a one NPM, one Node.js process, and it uses disk storage. And you put your NPM register to that Sinopia.
Okay.
Whenever it can't find the module downloaded on its local disk, it just hits NPM.
Right. So it's a cache between you and NPM.
Kind of, you know,
Yeah.
lazy proxy.
No, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think that's a really great idea. We'll say, kind of blanked a little bit, but that's something that's kind of automatic that puts it into place. Yarn is interesting too, because Yarn makes dependency updates a very explicit process, much like npm shrink wrap does. But there's some kind of more rationality around what you between Yarn and what you get with npm shrink wrap. So I've not been able to use it or dig into it, but I know it's kind of the community's lighting up with Yarn. It's much more like bundler. But it's kind of explicitly dependency. You can do that to an extent with npm shrink wrap, or the Sinopia thing. It sounds kind of cool because it's even like higher level, sits between you and the registry. Yeah, but I'll have to check that out. These are great. Yeah, it's been more like questions, more like, hey Dave, check this out. But yeah, yeah. So that's it. I'm done. Drop the thing out of here. Thanks, guys.